Hey, fifth graders. All right, so welcome to the end of social studies. This is the last unit, or the last lesson of the last unit. So all you would have left after this is obviously the packet and then the test. I don't know if any of you are actually going to get to this in the school year, since I'm making these shortly before the last day of school. But maybe some of you check them out just because you really wanted to see me in my not very epic beard that is growing in very slowly, with the gray that I blame on my daughters. Anyway, yeah, so before we get to this last lesson, which is going to be talking about September 11th, and even before I talk about the answers to the previous section uh, packet stuff, I just wanted to talk to you about, so we ended with Vietnam War, right? People are protesting the Vietnam War, and eventually we pull our troops out, all that good stuff, right? So that happens in like 1974, 75 area. And then the next thing that we talk about is in 2001. So that is almost 30 years of history that the book just skips, but they don't really skip it. Instead, what they do is they give you this little timeline here, which says 30 years of history at the top, just to kind of tell you all of the things that apparently they didn't think were very important that happened between here and September 11th. There's some important stuff, obviously, that happens in this time, but let's just kind of go through it really quickly here. So first of all, we have the Watergate scandal. Maybe some of you, when you heard President Richard M. Nixon, were like, "Oh wait, I know that guy. He's kind of a bad guy." So Nixon is probably the only president that he wasn't impeached. But if he had been impeached, the chances of him not being kicked out of office were almost zero. He was going to get kicked out of office, so instead he chose to resign. That was the Watergate scandal, which basically, so people found out, reporters and then also the FBI found out that Nixon and some of his people, and he was a Republican, so some of the people on the Republican side were spying on the Democrat Party and their strategies for winning elections. Nixon did not have to worry. He would have won re-election had he not gotten messed up in this. It was actually more about like congressional seats and governorships and things like that that it was really looking into. So Nixon, a little bit of a shady guy, at least in particular with this. Certainly, that's some high-level corruption right there. And so consequently, he removed himself from office, but he had to get out of office. And also, he's the first and only so far president to resign from being president of the United States. And he was kind of like, he's the guy who gets looked down on as being just the worst president. I don't know if you could argue that he was really the worst president. I think a lot of the things actually that he did as president were good. However, he certainly got mixed up in one of the worst scandals that a president has ever been mixed up in. So that was Nixon. Then we fast forward here. A man named Jimmy Carter becomes president. And during his presidency, the United States is kind of going through an economic downturn. It's not really a depression, but it's certainly a recession, which is a stagnation of the economy. People are not feeling great about themselves. And then in 1979, which is the year I was born, so it's 41 years ago, in Iran, some Iranian revolutionaries stormed the U.S. embassy and captured a whole bunch of people and were holding them hostage. And basically, it was for 14 months. So for over a year, these people were held hostage. And then right as Carter loses the election, he was a one-term president, he loses the election to Ronald Reagan. And right about the time that Reagan takes over, the Iran hostage crisis comes to an end. And so with Reagan becoming president, a lot of people kind of feel like this uplifting of hope. And then that takes us basically into the 80s. Which were a time of a lot of hope for people, but also, some issues, of course, as well. So during Reagan's presidency, we have the next thing was in 1985. So this is the United States Soviet arms race or arms talks, and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev um, met with Ronald Reagan, and they signed a treaty that basically called for both of them to start getting rid of some of their nuclear weapons, things like that. Um, then fast forward 4 more years. Now we are a lot of this is actually Reagan that leads to this. However, he is no longer president. His vice president, which is George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, who will later be our president, his dad was president just for one term. But during that term, we hit 1989 when the Cold War ends. So basically, we have the collapse of the Soviet Union, and also kind of right about similar times as that, the war ends, and we talked about I was watching the fall of the Berlin Wall. So the Berlin Wall was torn down, and Germany was reunited, and a lot of these countries that had been under the Soviet Union were able to become their own countries once again. So yeah, one thing that's not going to be in your history books here is the fact that the United States wins the Cold War, obviously, because the Soviet Union ceases to exist, but also the United States wins it by outproducing the Soviet Union. One of the things that we were doing was we were creating a space defense program called Star Wars, was kind of its nickname. And just in trying to compete with the United States, not necessarily specifically with the Star Wars thing, which never worked really, but just in trying to keep up with the United States, the Soviet Union was spending so much money that they could not keep up with the machine that is the United States, and in particular is capitalism. And so consequently, they collapsed. Their country, their government fell apart, and they turned back into Russia and all of these other countries that had been kind of swallowed up by the Soviet Union and were now free. But that was 1989, and then was when the Berlin Wall fell, and then in 1991 was when the Soviet Union broke up into 15 independent countries, though Russia obviously was still the biggest of them. Then we fast forward, our next president is Bill Clinton, who was Hillary Clinton's husband, and he is impeached. So that was 1998. He was elected in 1992, and the book here says that he had successes both at home and overseas, including strengthening the economy and working for peace. Yeah, but also Bill Clinton happened to have lucked out into being the president when the internet became a thing, and we had what was called the .com bubble. But basically, all of these internet websites were being produced. People didn't really know what the internet was all about, but it was just sort of like this bubbling creation thing. It was not what it is today, where you've got a whole bunch of sites that just get lots and lots of business, and then you have a whole bunch of little other sites. You just had things popping up all over the place. People were creating websites and then selling them for millions of dollars. Internet companies were being created to supply internet through the phone line, because phones used to be plugged into the wall, and then you used to have your computer plugged into the wall, but it was like the same line as your phone. And so if somebody tried to call you while you were on the internet, they couldn't get through, or you would get kicked off the internet. It was this crazy thing. Anyway, a lot of people were making money, and like a lot of these things were being sold as stock. So like you'd have a website, and then you'd say, oh yeah, my company is selling stocks. And so people would just be buying up stocks, like, financialinventions.com. That sounds like an awesome website. I'm going to invest in them. And, do they produce anything? I don't know, but I'm just going to throw some money. So a lot of money was being produced, but it was a little bit artificial, and that bubble eventually popped. However, during the time when it was existing, when people were, it was producing a lot of money, even if it wasn't producing money that, like, in a real way, like nothing was really being created. It was sort of this weird thing. But the U.S. economy did great during that time, because like the stock market was going up and people were investing all this money, and then they were, their return on their investments was great, and so they had more money to buy things, and it was this cool thing. except for once people realized that a lot of these internet companies were not making anything and weren't, like there was really nothing to show for it. That bubble kind of burst, and there was a little bit of a recession after that that he didn't have to necessarily pay the price for. So anyway, but during this time, Bill Clinton has an affair with one of the interns that was working at the White House, Monica Lewinsky, and then he lied about it under oath. It says he was accused of lying. No, he straight up lied under oath. He was definitely lying. If you or I had done what Bill Clinton did, we would absolutely have gone to jail. However, when you are the president of the United States and you are playing perhaps fast and loose with the truth, and people are, happy with the way that the country is going, and things seem relatively peaceful. There was some terrorist attacks that they didn't succeed, and so we kind of just ignored them, but they lead into September 11th here later. Al Qaeda had tried to attack the United States on one or maybe even two occasions, but just it didn't work as well. But basically, things were going well in the country. People felt really good about the country there in the 90s for the most part. And so consequently, he's impeached, but everybody's like, this is pointless. This is dumb. We don't care about it. And so he's found innocent, or at least he's not kicked out of office, which I guess is being found innocent. But I don't think to this day anybody really argues that Bill Clinton did not lie under oath, because he was a lawyer. He was basically disbarred, which means you don't get to be a lawyer anymore, because he was definitely lying under oath, and you can't do that as a lawyer. So the Senate did vote to let him stay in office. However, kind of put a black mark on him a little bit. Then in 2000, we have the election between Al Gore, who was the vice president, and George W. Bush, who was the son of George H.W. Bush, who was served before Bill Clinton. George H.W. Bush served for one term, like I said. Bill Clinton is the one that beat him so that he didn't get his second term. And then Clinton served for 2 terms, and then George W. Bush ran for office against Al Gore. Bush had a slim lead in Florida, but the race was so close that a recount was required by law. 5 weeks later, the Supreme Court ruled that there wasn't time for a recount. So Gore did win he won the popular vote, kind of like we had with Trump and Hillary Clinton. Gore won the popular vote. There was a lot of issues in Florida, which seems like it's happened multiple times since then. But it was extremely close in Florida, and whoever won Florida was going to win the election. However, I think even in subsequent recounts, nobody has ever said Al Gore won Florida, he should have won the election. Even though the Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to just keep doing recounts and recounts and recounts. We need to have a president who's ready. 5 weeks later is a month later. So the election is in November. You take over office in January. It is now December, and we still don't know who won this election. So the Supreme Court says, we're done. The president has to have time to, prepare to be president, to get his office and get, his staff ready and things like that. So we're just going to call this election. We're not going to keep recounting forever. And so consequently, Al Gore conceded, and George W. Bush became our president. And that leads us into present day challenges, which is lesson 6. But first, obviously, let's go over the packet for lesson 4. For lesson 5. So in 1954, in the 1954 case of Brown versus the Board of Education made C, school segregation, illegal. Board of Education probably should have told you that this had to do with schools, which gets rid of A and B, and then I don't think anybody thinks that an all-girls school is illegal nowadays. Maybe. I don't know if you could have an all-boys school. Obviously, I think you can have an all-girls school, but I don't know if you can have an all-boys school. It's one of those things. I don't know. Anyway, number 2, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his "I Have a Dream" speech during, this is D, the March on Washington, D.C. Number 3, what was Cesar Chavez's goal for the United States, or for the United Farm Workers, the UFW? A, higher wages for migrant workers. Okay, so number 4, what did civil rights protesters want? This is kind of a weird question. A lot of times we say civil rights and we just kind of think of African Americans, right? Like they wanted their rights. Uh, so you might say like the end of segregation or something like that. But civil rights isn't like civil doesn't mean black people rights. Okay, so civil rights has to do with basically for everybody. So what I put down was equal rights for everyone. I think that if you look at women's suffrage movement, which is their move towards getting the right to vote, that's a civil rights issue. If you talk about like handicap people with disabilities having access or equal access to schools and facilities and things like that, that's a civil rights issue. So there's lots of civil rights issues that a lot of times we say the civil rights movement, we think just of Martin Luther King and the movement to have black people, get rid of segregation and have black people be treated equally. And that's definitely part of it, but I don't think it's the whole thing. So I think if you just wrote equal rights for everyone, that's probably like a pretty all-encompassing answer. If you have, something about black people, that's fine too. But just know that it's for everyone. Number 5, during the Vietnam War, what did the Hawks want and what did the Doves want? So this was the very end. This had to do with people who were protesting the war. The Hawks, kind of like back during the Spanish-American War, there was the War Hawks, right, that wanted to go to war. So in this case, the Hawks wanted to fight North Vietnam, and in particular, they wanted to stop the spread of communism. The Doves, on the flip side, wanted the United States to stay out of wars where its own safety was not threatened. Vietnam was a weird war, and maybe one that we shouldn't get into, or shouldn't have gotten into, kind of debatable. But at the same time, so a lot of times we look at like, oh, the Hawks, they just wanted to fight war, like that's bad. The Doves, they just wanted peace, that's good. One of the reasons why we had World War II was because there were many opportunities to stop Hitler, and basically everybody did what the Doves said. They said, this fight doesn't concern us, so we're going to allow it to happen. Germany invades several little surrounding countries. France and England could have stepped in and said, no, that is not okay. We're not going to allow this. And instead they said, they're not fighting us. It's okay. He's just going to take these little areas and then not us, and not attack us. No big deal. Even when he invaded Poland, they were kind of like, do we really want to get involved in this? Like, they're just taking over Poland. Who cares? But they weren't going to stop. So the United States, as the superpower in the world, or one of the main superpowers in the world, on the one hand, we want to say like, hey, who cares about this or who cares about that? As long as they're not messing with us, what do we care? But instability can lead to more instability. So if you have countries that are taking over other countries, it's possible that, that's a fight that maybe we don't need to get into, but also maybe we do, because maybe we stop bigger conflicts from happening later. It's kind of the counter argument, I guess, to what the Doves were saying, which the book kind of presents as, I felt like the book maybe leaned a little towards the Doves sounding like they were in the right as opposed to the Hawks. But again, not everything is black and white. There's shades of gray in between the two, and you don't know right or wrong. There's not always just a clear-cut answer. All right. Vocabulary, number 1. Prejudice means to judge someone negatively before you know anything about them. Number 2, the Voting Rights Act allowed federal agents to use their power to make sure that citizens were allowed to vote. Number 3, the Civil Rights Act made it illegal for employers to discriminate against someone because of race, color, religion, nationality, or gender. And number 4, a person who travels from farm to farm to help harvest crops is a migrant farm worker. So I hope you guys enjoyed trying to squish those into those teeny little lines. This next one is going to be even worse. So lesson 6 is present day challenges. And right in front here, this is September 11th. That is the World Trade Center towers being smashed into. So a little background on this, not background, for the history of this, but background for Mr. Lewin. I was not quite married. I was engaged to my wife at the time, and we were um, I was working at a bagel shop, and I just remember that morning I was in there working, and somebody came in and said, "Hey, did you hear an airplane crashed into the World Trade Center towers?" And we were like, "Wow, that's crazy." And nobody knew. Some people thought that maybe it was like a little small airplane. We were kind of confused. And then as the day wore on, or as the morning wore on, because this happened all relatively quickly, we started to find out, no, that wasn't just a little airplane. That was a big airplane. And another one hit, and then another one hit the Pentagon, and then there was another one that crashed in Pennsylvania. And it was this big thing, and it was unbelievably terrifying. I went back to my apartment. My wife came over, or my fiance at the time came over, and we sat and we just watched the news kind of all day, just as things rolled along. And that was actually kind of the beginning of this 24-hour news cycle where the news was just on, like CNN and things like that, where they were just on all the time. There's always news flowing at you, which you can argue if that's good or bad now, but that was sort of the beginning of it being like a big thing. Anyway, so part A is September 11th, 2001. On September 11th, 2001, men armed with box cutters hijacked 4 jet airliners. 2 airliners were flown into the World Trade Center in New York City. One hit the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The 4th crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. Over 3,000 people died in the attacks. The men who hijacked the planes on September 11th, 2001, committed acts of terrorism. That's your first vocabulary word. Terrorism is the use of fear and violence by non-government groups against civilians to achieve political goals. Terrorism in the United States. There have been many acts of terrorism in American history. See World War II, or since World War II, many terrorist attacks on Americans have been carried out by Muslim groups from the Middle East. A Muslim is someone who follows the religion of Islam. A few radical Muslims who want their society to be very strict are willing to use violence to force change. They think European and American ideas have hurt their society. They also think Israel should not exist. So Israel did not exist until the end of World War II. After World War II, the United Nations, one of their first things that they did was they carved out a piece of land from Jordan, basically, which was a country there, and they said, okay, this is Israel, this belongs to the Jewish people. And they gave it back to the Jews, and it happens to include, Jerusalem and things like that. However, there was people who were living there, and, they really didn't have any say in the fact that they had just been kicked out of their homes and told, hey, this area of land, this is no longer your country, go somewhere else. And so consequently, a lot of, and also in this, Israel, of course, being Jewish, they are not Muslims. They don't believe in Islam. And so consequently, the countries surrounding them have major beef against them. One, because, these Western countries just created this area and said, hey, Israel gets to exist. And 2, they happen to be a country that does not follow Islam, and a lot of the surrounding nations really have an issue with that. Probably in addition to that, there's the fact that Israel has, at least quite a bit, been a rather successful country, and some of the surrounding countries have been far less successful in terms of like economic prosperity and things like that. So the people of, the Palestinians are kind of the ones, even though there's not a nation of Palestine, they are people from Jordan who just happen to be living in that area, but they're now called the Palestinians. There's lots of push for the Palestinians to have, either their own country or, be allowed to be part of Israel, though the Jewish people in Israel pretty much are like, we can't allow the Palestinians to be considered Israeli citizens because they have children having children faster than us. There are more of them than there are of us. If we let them be citizens and hold office and whatnot, we will cease to exist almost overnight. Like they will just get rid of us very quickly. So they're kind of fighting for their to keep their nation. There's a lot of Palestinian attacks on Israel and attacks from Israel on Palestine, but normally the terrorist attacks are Palestinians attacking Israel. My wife has actually been over there, and she has seen in the kind of the Palestinian headquarters, not in their headquarters, but just maps that the Palestinians have, there is no Israel on those maps. There is just Palestine. So basically, when there's all these talks about peace, that's all fine and good, except for at least the leaders of the Palestinian government, such as it is. It's kind of hard to have peace talks with people who think that you shouldn't exist. And so we've had lots of peace talks over the years. It's still not really a thing that's happened. We'll see if it ever happens. But if you take a look at the Bible, I mean, the people, the Arab people, basically, they trace their lineage basically back to Abraham. God promised Abraham that his son would become a nation and would be the chosen people, that sort of thing. Well, they think that Ishmael, his first son, who was basically, Abraham and Sarah were very old. Sarah essentially said, "Hey, here's my servant, marry her, and you can have a child through her, and that'll be like, that's how we'll help God along, because God needs help apparently." And the result of that was this boy Ishmael, and then of course later Sarah gets pregnant and she has Isaac. And so in the Muslim tradition, Ishmael was the chosen child and Isaac was just that other kid. And so there's kind of that split right there. And even in the Bible, it sort of talks about this this enmity between these two people who basically grew from Abraham, these two groups. And so it's as much as people want peace in the Middle East, and especially when they say that, they usually mean between Israel and Palestine, or Israel and all of the surrounding Arab nations. The fact is that most of them, these are two groups of people who have basically been fighting against each other for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. So is there ever going to be peace? Maybe not. We'll see. So anyway. So the attacks of September 11th, 2001 were carried out by a terrorist group called Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was created in 1988 by Osama bin Laden, a wealthy Saudi Arabian, to aid Muslims fighting Soviet troops in Afghanistan. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan in 1979. After the Soviets retreated in 1989, Al-Qaeda wanted to drive all Europeans and Americans out of Muslim nations and destroy Israel and unite all Muslims under a strict form of Islam. Al-Qaeda began attacking Americans in the Middle East and Africa in the 1990s. They also had an attack on the World Trade Center during Bill Clinton's presidency. I don't remember the exact year, but it was sometime before 2000 that had happened. President Bush was careful to explain that Islam was not to blame for the September 11th attacks. He said, and this is his quote, "The enemy is not our many Muslim friends. Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists." All right, part B, War on Terrorism. President Bush told Afghanistan to turn over Osama bin Laden and other members of Al-Qaeda to the United States. Afghanistan was ruled by a radical group called the Taliban that supported Al-Qaeda. They refused the president's demands. The United States and its allies invaded Afghanistan. They drove the Taliban from power and helped the people elect a new government. Osama bin Laden escaped, and the Taliban forces fled to the mountains to continue the fight. President Bush said the war would not end until, this is his quote, "Every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated." So basically, President Bush kind of came out and said, look, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. There's no other side that you can be on. And so when Afghanistan was like, we're not going to give you Al-Qaeda, or when the Taliban said that, then we were like, okay, then you're our enemy and we're going to destroy you. And we kind of have a little bit of a similar thing coming up here in Iraq, which we're going to talk about. The invasion of Iraq. President Bush worried that terrorists might obtain weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction can kill many people all at once. A nuclear bomb is one example of a weapon of mass destruction. Other examples are, there's like biological weapons, which are essentially like, diseases and things that can be spread. There's also chemical attacks. There's lots of different types of weapons of mass destruction. One country that concerned the president was Iraq. It had tried to build nuclear weapons and had helped terrorists. Iraq was led by a dictator named Saddam Hussein. In 1990, it invaded the country of Kuwait to seize Kuwait's oil. The United States and its allies drove the Iraqis out of Kuwait, but the war made Iraq an enemy of the United States. So this was actually during President H.W. Bush's presidency. So this is the first President Bush's presidency as the war in Iraq, and the United States went in there. We just drove the Iraqi military out of the country of Kuwait, which is this very little country. Iraq is quite large. Kuwait is very small. And so the United States drove them out, but we did not go into Iraq and invade there or anything like that. We just basically pushed them back so they were out of Kuwait and said, okay, good enough. So let's see. The American government became concerned that Iraq might help terrorists attack the United States. The United States and a coalition of allies were convinced that Iraq was hiding weapons of mass destruction. In 2003, they invaded Iraq. Saddam Hussein was captured. United States and coalition forces helped the Iraqi people hold free elections for the first time, but no weapons of mass destruction were found. Former members of Saddam Hussein's forces continued to fight, and al-Qaeda sent people to Iraq as well. At the same time, Iraqi society divided into several groups. Each formed a militia, and they began to fight with each other and fight against American troops. By mid-2007, the war in Iraq continued, and over 3,000 U.S. soldiers had been killed. So here is an Iraqi woman who has just voted. She's holding up, her finger has been dyed purple. So after you voted, you had to put your finger into this purple paint that wouldn't wash off right away. And so that was a way of keeping people from voting more than once, things like that. Okay, so part of this is basically just the fact that the book was written before the sort of end of the Iraq War. Basically what happened is during President Obama's 2 terms, the United States reduced the number of soldiers there. There was a whole lot of violence, as it talked about. There was, lots of different groups fighting each other. And we had to deal with roadside bombs. We had to deal with a lot of terrorist style attack kind of things. But eventually the United States essentially pulls most of its troops out. I think we had a few people there just to help train the Iraqis, things like that. But then shortly thereafter, a terrorist organization known as, depending on how you deal with their name, but it's either ISIS, which is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIL, which is Islamic State of Iraq and I think it's the Levant. Anyway, Islamic State, so IS basically. They grew up kind of almost a little bit in this power vacuum for all of Saddam Hussein's faults, and oh boy, are there a lot. He was a bad dude. The fact that he was this tyrannical dictator kind of helped keep some of the other groups from growing up, because as much as he loved power and killed a lot of people, he was not a hardcore believer in Islam, essentially. And so when he is captured and then we hand him over to the Iraqis and the Iraqis execute him, after that, there's a little bit of a power vacuum, as the Iraqi government is not quite strong enough to replace what Saddam Hussein was doing, especially because there's infighting. And so this group, ISIL, the Islamic State, kind of grows up and basically starts, spreading out and taking over. And so President Obama sent in troops back in, and actually they stayed. For the most part, the Islamic State, I think, has been pretty well crushed. However, we just in January of 2020, Iraq voted to basically tell the United States, hey, take all of your troops out of here. We don't want any of them here anymore. President Trump kind of objected, but then, of course, with the global pandemic, I have no idea what's going on there after that. But that's sort of where we're at with Iraq. So part C is global challenges. The economies of the world's countries are connected. Trade allows countries to export goods and raw materials. It also allows them to import goods and materials they need. This interdependence, one of your vocabulary words, or dependence on each other to meet the needs and wants, allows countries to specialize in certain products and materials. Trade agreements help countries do business. The North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, is one example. In 1993, Canada, Mexico, and the United States agreed to eliminate trade barriers among the countries. This formed one of the largest free trade zones in the world. Since then, the United States has increased the amount of goods it ships to Canada and Mexico. So again, a little bit out of date. NAFTA has actually kind of come to an end. President Trump did not like NAFTA, and so he argued for this different agreement. I don't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but basically it kind of replaces NAFTA. And I think one of the things that he was looking for was protection for American companies. One of the issues when you have this free trade zone is that if you have a country that can produce things cheaper than another country, then you can sell those goods for a lower price, which means that other country, if they have companies that are trying to produce that same thing, they can't compete. The United States pays its workers quite well. Down in Mexico, you do not have to pay them the same amount. And so consequently, it was, and maybe even still is, though it depends on what all is in the agreement that President Trump has signed. But basically, it was cheaper for U.S. companies to send the materials down to Mexican plants and then have the people in Mexico build the car or whatever and then ship it back to the United States than it was just to have U.S. workers doing that. Well, that's all fine and good for the company. However, all the people who would work in, like, say, an auto manufacturer plant, well, those guys are out of a job. Like they don't have a job, and that's bad for the U.S. economy. And so consequently, that was one of the things that people did not like about NAFTA, and that President Trump in particular did not like. And so they, whether or not they fixed it with the new agreement, I don't know. But that was one of the complaints about it. So environmental issues. As the global economy grows, it can improve the lives of millions of people. The growing economy can also affect the environment. Most factories, automobiles, and power plants burn fossil fuels, coal, oil, or natural gas. This releases pollution into the air that mixes with water vapor and falls as acid rain. Acid rain negatively affects the quality of soil and surface water in some areas of the United States. Pollution has created another serious problem: global warming. Global warming is an overall rise in the Earth's temperature. Burning fossil fuels releases gases, especially carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. Many scientists believe these gases help trap the sun's heat near Earth, causing a rise in temperature. This trapping of heat is called the greenhouse effect. Okay, so global warming is another one of your vocabulary words. The rise in temperature from global warming may contribute to extreme weather conditions, including powerful hurricanes. In 2005, a record number of hurricanes hit the United States. The worst hurricane, Katrina, flooded New Orleans, Louisiana, and the coast of Mississippi. More than 1,000 people died. Thousands of people lost their lives, or lost their homes and everything they owned. Okay, I got a major problem with this. I'm not disputing global warming. Whether or not it's man-made or not, I don't know. I'm certainly not smart enough, don't have enough degrees, don't know the science behind it. People say that it's caused by man-made pollutants. Okay, sure. However, we have had periods where we have had 0 hurricanes hit the United States. In fact, we've had a number of years since Katrina that we have had very few, if any, hurricanes hit the United States, and the ones that have been very weak. So saying that global warming caused Hurricane Katrina is a lie. That straight up, that is not what caused Hurricane Katrina. Really, the fact that Hurricane Katrina was so bad is because the city of New Orleans is built. New Orleans is on the coast, right? So they are right down there by the Gulf of Mexico, basically by the ocean, and yet the city itself is below the ocean. So if a hurricane, and Katrina was certainly a very powerful hurricane, if a hurricane hits New Orleans and is causing huge waves to come over, that's going to flood that city, and it's going to happen over and over again. They have dams and barriers and things built up, levees built up to stop that from happening. But if those levees break, which is not the fault of global warming or anything else, then the city is going to flood, and that's what happened in 2005. So, while I can, not arguing global warming or anything like that, but the idea that global warming causes increased hurricanes or stronger hurricanes is, if it's true, then it certainly isn't happening yet, because we have had weak hurricanes and we've had strong hurricanes. We've had them before, we will have them later, but they don't seem, at least as near as I can tell, to have been affected very much by global warming. Sorry, my door just slammed out there. Anyway, yeah, so there's that. Okay, the future. The biggest changes in your lifetime may result from developments in science and technology. The science of genetics is one example. Scientists use computers to map the genes in the human body. Genes are tiny parts of cells that determine how you look and grow. Doctors hope to use genetic research to cure diseases and help people live longer. Scientists are also trying to change the way we produce energy. Oil and coal supplies are likely to run out someday, probably not as recently as it makes it sound like there. That sounds like it's going to run out in your lifetime. I don't think that's going to happen. Before they do, we need more clean and renewable sources of energy. These include sun, wind, and fuels such as ethanol, which is made from corn. Also, nuclear energy. That's nuclear energy is technically green energy, but it's never on the list because a lot of people are scared of it, I guess. Anyway, countries such as Denmark produce large amounts of energy through with huge windmills. So does Iowa. Someday, we may even place huge panels in space to collect solar energy and send it back to Earth. All right, that is the end of that last lesson. I'm kind of annoyed by it, but it is what it is. Also, that is the end of Unit 8. So, congratulations, you have made it through all of social studies. I apologize, this is kind of a long video. Hopefully it wasn't too boring or anything like that, or if nothing else, it's on YouTube, so you can break it up into chunks and just watch it a little bit at a time. So let's go over the Unit 6, or Lesson 8, Unit 6 answers. So number one is blank was one of the sites of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, and that would be the World Trade Center. Number two, after the attacks on September 11th, 2001, what did the United States ask Afghanistan to do? A, hand over terrorists to the United States. Number three, NAFTA is blank between the United States, or between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. It's a trade agreement. So number four, in 1991, the United States sent troops to the Persian Gulf region. What is this region's most valuable resource today? Did it even talk about that? It's kind of a weird... to seize Kuwait's oil. Okay, so there's one little, not even full sentence out of that, but the natural resource that's really in all of the Middle East that we consider valuable is oil. Number five, what country did the United States invade in 2003? That would be Iraq. On the back side, so the vocabulary review, the use of fear and violence against innocent people to achieve political goals is called terrorism. Number two, global warming is the overall rise in temperature of the Earth's atmosphere. Number three, the largest free market zone in the world was created by, good luck fitting this on there, though if you just wrote NAFTA, that would have worked, but it's the North American Free Trade Agreement is the thing that comes out of that box. Number four, interdependence means that the economies of countries all over the world are tied together. So interdependence is the answer to number four. Kind of interesting, but we just discovered here recently with this whole pandemic thing that interdependence is not necessarily always a great thing. I think you're still going to find that countries, our economies are going to be tied together. That's been the case for hundreds of years, or at least for quite a long time. Actually for about 100 years. But I think after, China, if you look on the back of just about anything that, you have in your house, it probably says made in China, at least some of them do. And yet they had this big, this disease that broke out and has spread around the world and killed thousands of people and really damaged economies as people are unable to work. So you might find that some countries start pulling back and saying, hey, why don't we just try and make most, if not all of our stuff here rather than having, this country or that country be in charge of making those things, especially as, if you have this global pandemic and we stop, that country isn't able to produce goods and we're not having, the same level of diseases here. Might be nice if we could produce some of those things. Obviously, not every country can produce every type of good. But we'll see. Maybe interdependence is going to be a thing in, history books down the roads that are like, yeah, the world used to be like this, and then they decided that was stupid. Anyway, like I said, hope you enjoyed this. Good luck, and I will be sending out the test probably about the same time that I'm uploading this video. Good luck on the test, and enjoy your summer. Talk to you later. Bye.